Leading off our discussion tonight are Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and Austan Goolsbee, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. He's currently a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. And Austan, I wouldn't typically start with you in a discussion like this, but it was actually the president's economic advisor that was putting out information today that seemed contrary to some of the warnings that we were getting from the CDC and the World Health Organization and other organizations. Those people who are involved in the medical side of things saying this is pretty serious. There are a lot of investors saying this is pretty serious. And yet we've got the president and his economic advisors playing it down.
Indeed. Why? You know, I'm friends with Larry Kudlow. I know you know him. Why get out in front of that? It's clear that everywhere this disease is, there are a bunch of medical question marks we don't know the answer to. How fast does it spread? What is the mortality rate? What can be done to slow it down? Why get up and say everything's fine, we're close to having a vaccine, the stock market is going to go back up? It doesn't, on the grounds of either the economic facts of what negative impact will that have on the economy. I think a lot of the jury's still out, but a lot of people are nervous about that. And on the financial aspect, it's clear the stock market believes that if this disease were to spread, there's going to be some serious setbacks for investors. So I just think it was not wise either medically or economically
to get out in front of that. Dr. Fauci,
get out in front.
Let's get the information that we need. And I don't think I'm different from any other American in wanting to know the basics on this thing. Where's it going? How serious is it going to get? How will we protect ourselves? Where are we with respect to a vaccine or some form of protecting ourselves?
Okay, so let's start off with your questions. Right now, if you look at what's going on in the United States at the present time, I think that's where the confusion comes in from the discussion that you just had a moment ago. Right now, there are 14 cases, 12 travel from Wuhan, 2 spouses of the travelers, and a whole bunch of people that we brought over from the Diamond Princess. Right now, there's no person-to-person transmissibility in the United States. So from that standpoint, things are, quote, under control. But if you look beyond the United States and the potential for the impact on have with us, it is far from over, because a lot of other countries, particular countries like South Korea, like Italy, like Japan, are having community spread, person to person to person. When that happens, you then have the possibility and the likelihood that you're going to have a pandemic, which means as well prepared as you are, you're going to get cases in this country, and we will be challenged about how we're going to be able to respond to them and to control them. So I think that's the disparity. What's going on today, and what is the potential of what might happen if we have a pandemic?
So, to be clear, today in the United States, no one has spread it to anyone else in the United States. Everybody who's suffering from coronavirus right now got it somewhere else, and it is contained to that extent. The issue
except for two. The
spouses of the two people who had come in. Right. We don't have what's called community spread that we're getting it at movie theaters or at schools or on the subway or on airplanes just yet. The CDC has said it's not a matter of if we will, it is a matter of when. They are fairly certain that we will get to that point. Do you agree with that?
I do. I agree that we will have cases in the United States, and it is likely that we will have some community spread. The critical issue is, will we be able to control it? And the reason the CDC and Nancy Messonnier said that is because she's correct. There are community spread throughout countries in the world. And when you have community spread out there, it's almost inevitable that it's going to spill over into other countries, including our own.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time. The Democratic debate in Charleston, South Carolina is over. I want to thank Dr. Anthony Fauci and Austan Goolsbee. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brian Williams for our full post-debate coverage.
Well, good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York with thanks to Ali Velshi. That will be the last time we see this collection of Democrats on one stage before the vote in 15 states. And it may be the last time we see several of these candidates on a debate stage, period. Lots of attention on the frontrunner Bernie Sanders tonight. He went first, attacking Bloomberg right out of the box. Bloomberg wasted no time invoking the Russians.
Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected so you'll lose to him.
And let me tell Mr. Putin, who interfered in the 2016 election, try to bring Americans against Americans. Hey, Mr. Putin, if I'm president of the United States, trust me, you're not going to interfere in any more American elections.
I'll tell you what the Russians want. They don't have a political party. They want chaos, and chaos is what is coming our way. I mean, look, if you think the last 4 years has been chaotic, divisive, toxic, exhausting, imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. Think about what that will be like for this country.
It went on about like that. Here for our discussion, post-game show, as it were, Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, professor and assistant dean out at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas. Lawrence O'Donnell, host of The Last Word, 10 p.m. weeknights, most weeknights, that is, here on this network. Robert Gibbs, former White House press secretary under President Obama. In the spin room down in Charleston, South Carolina tonight, Chris Matthews, host of Hardball. At the big board again for us tonight, our national political correspondent, Steve Kornacki. Good evening and welcome to you all. Chris Matthews at the venue. Your impressions of what we just heard and witnessed tonight.
Well, you know, I thought that Biden had his best night, maybe because he feels good about his chances down here. He's been talking them up for months that he's going to win South Carolina. I think he acted like it. He seemed to have a lot of homework, a lot of little things, doodads he threw in tonight. I also thought something interesting. He seemed to have had a cheering section tonight he never had before. There was a lot of blast at all. Every time he said something that was reasonably good, there was a big reaction in the audience out here. So I thought he had his act together down here, maybe because he's got more troops. I was not surprised, but I was taken again by Elizabeth Warren's assault on Mike Bloomberg. I don't know why she trained her guns on him, but we'll talk to her later tonight. But, boy, she went after him really serious again tonight about the NDAs, of course. Not satisfied at all with what he's put out so far. And, of course, going after him on redlining again. She hit him in 2 weak points again very hard. I think she stymied his ability to perform well tonight. What else? Buttigieg, very tough on Bernie tonight. He had a lot of good points. He went after him on the Castro stuff, very strong, which I was surprised nobody else did, saying you can't sell out the best side of the Castro in this country and win. I thought it was very strong. He was really ready to go. So figuring out the politics. I don't know what Warren is up to. I'll find out tonight maybe. She seems to be much more concerned about knocking Bloomberg out of the race than she is in taking on the front runner, the clear front runner now, Bernie Sanders. I don't know the politics there, what she's doing there. Buttigieg has decided he's going to make his money, he's going to make his points now against Bernie, which is so interesting what he's up to. He is playing for real right now in a very tough assault on Bernie. Well, that's what I've seen tonight. A lot of politics, a lot of intramurals, one-on-ones in some cases, man-to-man defense, if you will. A lot of it tonight. A lot of people targeting different enemies, different rivals. I thought it was very fascinating tonight. A good debate.
All right, Chris Matthews will, of course, be coming back to you often. Eugene, I note a South Carolinian, a genuine South Carolinian. What did you make of the crowd tonight? Chris is right. We heard kind of cheering sections for Bloomberg and Biden that heretofore we had not heard.
Yeah, it was interesting that they sort of packed the hall with their supporters who cheered at the appropriate times. I agree with Chris. Biden probably had his best debate. He was not just forceful, but he was substantive. He is strong in every debate on foreign policy, I thought, and they spent a long time on foreign policy.
It was a good night for him to have a good night.
Exactly. Bloomberg could not have done worse than in the last debate. In fact, he did a lot better, I thought. Who knows? Bernie Sanders did not seem to me to be quite at the top of his game tonight. He just seemed a little bit off. Maybe that was subdued for Bernie Sanders a little bit. I don't know how much this is going to impact. There are two audiences. There's a big national audience, but there's a very specific audience of voters in South Carolina that they're all playing to. And you could see Biden going after Steyer because Steyer is registering, especially among African-American voters in South Carolina. And Biden needs to sort of quell that. You saw everybody going after Bernie, particularly Buttigieg, because the calculation is that if Bernie were to win South Carolina, he would be very, very hard to stop. And so it was at times, you know, another food fight. Kind of like the last debate, but there were also moments when I think we maybe learned a bit more about the candidates. So, you know, we'll see.
Professor, there was some speculation, for what it's worth, on social media that Bernie was not used to being booed at these things, and he was audibly booed 3 times at least that I counted, and maybe was, as a result, a little bit off balance.
Right, which came first, the chicken or the egg? We were noting earlier that he seemed a little bit off, whether that he came in off or that was a reaction to the crowd. Agreeing with my colleague here, Biden had a great night because he looked presidential. He didn't bring up the coronavirus first. That was Mike Bloomberg. So props to him for bringing up the thing that keeps me up at night these days. But the fact that he took it and he ran with it. He talked about the Ebola virus, even though it's not the same thing. But he talked about what he would do as president when he's dealing with issues such as these. So for Biden, it wasn't just the foreign policy. It was also the presidentialism that he brought with it. It was the energy. So Biden up here in terms of energy, Sanders down here.
Lawrence O'Donnell, here's the question. Is there a future president on that stage tonight?
There is a future president on that stage. We're not sure which one it's going to be. This debate will forever be known as the naked cowboy debate.
I guess. Can you explain to the viewers?
Yeah.
Well,
they have no idea.
Thank you.
They have no idea.
Mike Bloomberg did a joke about the naked cowboy, which is a character that you'll see wandering around Times Square. And as a service to the viewers, I retweeted a picture of the naked cowboy.
Thank you.
So you can all go
Can we
find
emphasize, because some kids are still up, he's wearing...
He does have
underpants.
Underwear.
Tidy whities.
And it actually says naked cowboy on the other. But this was Mike Bloomberg's attempt at a joke. There were several flat deliveries of jokes by Mike Bloomberg. Some of them were obviously scripted, and so part of the homework for reviving this candidacy within the debate was going to be, let's use that New York humor that absolutely did not work. He was substantive on education and on other subjects where he did much better than last time. But for Biden in South Carolina, it looks like he did what he had to do for South Carolina, but this was the California debate. More than anything else, this was the California debate. It's the last time California voters see these people in the debate stage. And California has these 3 hugely expensive media markets: San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Bloomberg's the only one who can really buy those markets the way you need to buy them now. So for Elizabeth Warren, for Klobuchar, for Buttigieg at this stage of the financing of his campaign, this was their chance to reach California voters, Texas voters at the same time. They're less time they're going to see the Super Tuesday voters.
Robert, I have to say, Lawrence just referenced it. Maybe there was a lull in the noise from the stage, but tonight Bloomberg's education answer seemed to cut through, provided it all stands up to fact-checking, but it was just one moment amid a sea of them. What did you make of it?
Well, he definitely had a better debate. I mean, as was said, hard to not go up. Though I'm sure my son watched his joke on the naked cowboy and said, "Okay, boomer." But look, I think the 2 things that happened tonight, Biden had, as somebody else said, a good night to have a good night, right? He's the only other candidate that's been on the ballot. We don't know about Bloomberg yet, but he's the only other candidate that's been on a ballot that's capable and has drawn a multiracial coalition. If he can win South Carolina and get to not just Super Tuesday, but some of the states beyond Super Tuesday with a much higher degree of African-American voters, not as high as will be in South Carolina on Saturday, but still a good part of the electorate, he has an opportunity to become the person that faces maybe Bernie Sanders more closely one-on-one. I think Bernie didn't have as strong a night for whatever reason, but I think it's also important to understand this was the first time. He's run for president now twice. It's the first time he's walked out on that stage with those bright lights as the consensus front runner.
Yeah.
And a lot of pitches came, not in the strike zone, but right at his head tonight. And it's a little bit different, right? He's been a very consistent performer in these debates, and that's helped him. But tonight, a much, much different set of pitches that he faced. Some that he did okay on, the very first question. Some, like with guns, and others that he struggled a bit with.
Well, you know, I got to say, his guns answer, I thought, was one of the best answers I've ever seen in a debate. When he talked about some of his past votes on guns that were in alignment with what the NRA wanted, he said, those were bad votes. I cast bad votes. Now, there's no one who's been in the Congress for 30 years who can't say that, and they say it to you privately, but there are very few who would ever admit it publicly. And every one of these candidates has something in their past that they don't want you to talk about, and Bernie handled that part of it, I think, as well as you can. He can't deny what those votes were. He has a different position now. What matters really when you're voting for these people is what's their position now and what are they going to do tomorrow?
And of course, a lot of Democrats have been lamenting ever since the words Fidel Castro were uttered on 60 Minutes that, in part, the party and these candidates have spent some of their time thus far this week debating about Fidel Castro. As anticipated, it came up on stage again tonight.
I have opposed authoritarianism all over the world, and I was really amazed at what Mayor Bloomberg just said a moment ago. He said that the Chinese government is responsive to the Politburo. But who the hell is the Politburo responsive to? Who elects the Politburo? You got a real dictatorship there? Of course you have a dictatorship in Cuba. What I said is what Barack Obama said in terms of Cuba, that Cuba made progress on education. Yes, I think, really? Really?
Joe Biden had a response for that, that right after Bernie finished. But again, you heard the boos from the crowd, which is a new look.
That's a new look
for a very formidable candidate.
He hasn't really heard that before. You know, a couple of things about this Castro discussion we're having. Number one, Fidel Castro is, in fact, deceased.
Do you have a calendar on you?
I do. And so he's no longer with us. The system he put in place in Cuba is still with us. I've spent a lot of time in Cuba. I've written a book about Cuba. So so I do know a bit about it. It's a terrible, it's an atrocious, repressive, awful government that, yes, increased the literacy rate in Cuba, but you ought to be able to get that sequence right, I think, because the bad very clearly outweighs the good.
For most of it.
And so if you express it the other way around, that's kind of not good.
Hang on one second, because I'm just told Chris Matthews standing by with Tom Steyer down in the spin room at the debate venue. Chris?
Yeah. I am. Thank you, Brian. Tom, what do you make of this debate? Because it has, I think 60 Minutes deserves credit. They got the question out there on the table of Bernie Sanders' ideological flirtations, whatever you call them, over the years. I grew up with Castro as a kid. We all rooted for him until he started executing every one of his enemies by firing squad, allying himself with the Soviet Union, and at one point aiming medium-range nuclear weapons at every one of our major cities short of Seattle. We began to think maybe he's not our friend.
Well, let me put it this way. There's no way that the President of the United States should be saying nice things about totalitarians who are enemies of the United States.
Yeah.
And that's the main point. Bernie is saying nice things. He's going out of his way to say nice things about someone who was an enemy of the United States and a totalitarian who didn't believe in human rights and actually led his country into poverty and servility.
Let's talk about some of your comments tonight. I hope tonight to use these opportunities in the spin room to give people a chance to expand on what they said.
Yeah.
You were pretty tough about what seems to be the new big, well, you're a big spender, but we're talking about, the way you talked about, imagine the choice we have here between a Democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders, and a guy who's basically been a Republican.
He has. Look,
How did you come to this?
Chris, I came into this race because I want to fight for people, working people in America, for economic justice, which I've been fighting for years, for racial justice, which I've been fighting for years, and for climate justice because we're in a crisis and we need to deal with it. I am terrified that if the Democratic Party goes with a socialist or a Republican, that in fact we're not going to win. What we're going to do is re-elect Donald Trump, and that is going to hurt every single person that I've been working for years in a very substantial way. And so I'm asking Democrats to come together behind a progressive Democrat who can pull the party together, somebody like me who actually stands for progressive policies, so we can go out and beat Donald Trump in November of 2020, which is what we have to do across the board.
There are real issues in this campaign, and one of them you talked about tonight, the nature of the health care system. All Democrats struggle for some kind of universal health care system, but we also struggle for freedom.
Yeah, and
it's a big part of our culture. And I looked it up. The New York Times had a great story in it today, and you talked about it tonight, that in the UK, in Canada, there are alternatives. You're not sucked into one system. You're not told you have to believe and rely on the federal government, in this case, to give you your health care. You're allowed to have private options in all these other countries.
Look, I've been saying, I know Bernie's trying to deal with real problems, and he's brought them up, and I give him credit for it. But having the government take over large parts of the economy is a dramatic mistake. It doesn't work for working people. It doesn't work for families. It doesn't work, period. It's been tried 1,000 times. It's never worked. We have to have a competitive, dynamic private sector. We can't have those corporations running the government the way they are now. This capitalism we have now isn't working for the people. But that doesn't mean the answer is for the government to take over the private sector.
Well, what's democratic socialism? I would think democratic would mean you have an option not to do it. There'd be a free society option. Democratic, it doesn't seem democratic if you must go with the only healthcare system available to you is federal government run, and if you don't like it, you're stuck.
But it's not just about choice, Chris.
Okay.
It's also about whether the government can do a good job by itself. And if you look at the Sanders climate plan, it involves the government buying the electrical system, electricity system in the United States and running it. That's not a good idea. You know,
the way the Democrats ran the Iowa caucuses, that way?
Well, people are going to say that, and it's not dumb. What is right is for the government to step up and put in rules for the private sector to live by.
Let's talk about you for a second. I don't know if you're on strong ground here. I know it's popular to say what you said tonight. Let's have term limits, as if that takes away all the bad guys. How would you do that under the Constitution? How would you get the Congress to install term limits on itself? I don't see how that ever can happen.
The only way you'd actually have to do it is you'd have to grandfather every single person who's in there now. So they're not voting for anything that affects them. It's only
but they want their kids to have these jobs.
Well, that could be true, Chris, but that's too bad. Look, we have a problem here.
You know there's a constitutional problem.
You know that we have a problem where the corporations own this government. That's why we have all this
I'm not sure
gun violence.
But that's your position, term limits.
Well, it's not just that. I get rid of the idea that corporations are people when it comes to spending.
Citizens United.
There's I do public financing of elections. We've got to change the structure of the system itself, Chris.
It's getting lively. Brian, back to you.
All
Tom
right.
Steyer.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tom Steyer. Now to our own Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent, Trymaine Lee. North Charleston tonight at a debate watch party that was hosted by Black Voters Matter. Hey, Trymaine.
Hey, how's it going? Yep, it's wrapping up here now. Black Voters Matter, a nonpartisan organization that's really going across the country to try to engage black voters and stretch voter participation, especially in black communities, especially in the South. Now, I talked to folks all night about who they were deciding to vote on and whether or not anything they heard during the debate swayed them one way or the other. Some folks were rock steady on who they were going to vote for, whether it be Sanders or Biden. Others said there were certain folks they would definitely not vote for, Mike Bloomberg. But I'm with Joy Jennings here. She's a resident of Charleston, South Carolina. Came into this night somewhat undecided, but leaning towards Sanders. Are you committed now?
I'm 95% committed to Bernie Sanders at this point.
Bernie Sanders. What is it about Sanders?
Education. It's all about education for me.
There are a lot of folks who are concerned about his rise and his surge, especially among young voters, that this may be causing some trouble for the establishment. Does that concern you at all?
Well, we need to cause trouble for the establishment because the establishment is who we're fighting against at this point.
So it feels like a fight against the establishment to do something new?
Yes, definitely, definitely.
What do you make of this generational divide, especially among black folks, where older voters over 45 are skewing towards Biden and younger towards Sanders? Is there something to this shakeup that you think?
The older generation, they're more traditional, I think, in going with Biden, supports tradition, his ties to Obama, and we love Obama, so nobody wants to be against Obama. But I'm educated, and the generation after me, they're educated too, in a different way, but they're book smart. And so we look at all the facts and we make our own decisions in the new generation. Yeah. Tradition's okay to have and respect, but we've got to go with issues that's going to affect us and our children and our children's children. That's what I'm thinking about. And that's why I'm for education and Bernie Sanders.
Thank you so very much. I'll tell you what, here in South Carolina, Charleston especially, they're a very engaged electorate. Not to make too much of the Emmanuel Church Massacre and the impact that that had on folks in this community, but for them, the long struggles for voting rights and respect and being included, you know, they don't call this the black primary for anything. You know, you think about 60% of the electorate is African-American here, so folks are locked in, making their last-minute decisions. But talking to folks in this room especially, they're serious, and they're thinkers, and they're really trying to make sure they make the best decision for the future.
Tremaine, thank you. Please thank your guest for us. Fascinating, all of it. And by the way, congrats. Tremaine's new podcast called Into America premieres this Thursday, as luck would have it. A break for our coverage. When we come back, Chris will be joined by another candidate from that debate stage tonight in South Carolina.
If we spend the next 4 months tearing our party apart, we're going to watch Donald Trump spend the next 4 years tearing our country apart.
Someone had to say it. That was one of the moments from on stage tonight in South Carolina. That's someone, Minnesota Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, standing by with Chris Matthews. Chris?
Thank you, Brian. Senator, it's great. You know, it's so interesting, and you know, Lawrence O'Donnell knows a lot more of this than I know about the Senate rules and all, but I am stunned at these arguments. First of all, they just say, we're going to get rid of the filibuster rule, just like that. I think that's been part of our tradition since the beginning. We're just going to do it here in this debate. I go, is that really something that's going to happen?
I think that we need to step back. That's what I tried to do in this debate, Chris. That's what I was just talking about, and not tearing our party apart. First of all, there's a lot of things that are procedural and people like to talk about to attack each other. Yeah. But there's all these people tuning in that haven't been watching this at all. They don't know what they're talking about. And I know that the sound bites on the news will most likely be Elizabeth's attack on Bloomberg or this, but I promise you, my answer on rural health care, more important to more people.
You said something that jumped out at me, and I don't like numbers on TV. It's the worst medium for it, but you said something really smart. You said this guy's total social package of spending is $60 trillion, which is 3 times the United States economy, not the government, 3 times the entire thing.
Exactly.
Oh, I think that got my attention.
Well, it did. I kept trying to think, how can we explain this? Because it sounds so alluring to think, oh, I can get free college, I can get free
Grandpa's paying for everything. You don't have to listen to your parents.
Well,
everything's coming our way.
You can't pay for it, and then same with Elizabeth's plan, by the way. You can't pay for it, and then also there's no plan to get it done.
Well, you said that Bernie can't get it done. Those are your words. Tell me why he can't get it done and you can.
First of all, you look at the track record. As I said, I'm the one that was ranked the most effective Democratic senator by Vanderbilt just last Congress. He was in the bottom group. So who do you think can get things done?
Is that his reputation on the Hill that he's had a lot of ideology?
He has gotten a few things done. That is true, but it's a lot of speeches. Number 2, I truly believe that if you look at my pay-fors, everything from changing the capital gains rate to going back to the estate tax exemption to where it was under Barack Obama. They are very straightforward ways to pay for things. And he, as he said, he doesn't want to talk about the nickels and dimes, but it is $60 trillion. I wanted to make that point that Super Tuesday Day, South Carolina, then Super Tuesday, these voters, a third of America, have to decide who do they want leading this ticket. And my case was straightforward. I'm from the middle of the country. I've gotten things done, and I bring people with me in every election, Republicans, independents, suburban and rural, and that's why I ask people to join me at amyklobuchar.com to help us out.
You know, I have a young person working on my staff who says we have to have hope. In other words, someone has to come out and say, I'm going to make radical, dramatic changes in your life, whether it's student loans or it's public college tuition or it's health care. And if you're too practical, it doesn't grab them.
Yeah, but we lost an election in 2016. We didn't lose hope. And my plans, like many others, are actually really progressive. Finally doing something about climate change in a big way. Getting immigration reform done in the first year. I know how to do it. Bringing down the cost of student loans significantly. Making sure that kids get free 1- and 2-year degrees. I mean, come on, that's a big deal. And we have to start being willing to talk about it that way.
Your 10th debate was tonight.
Yes.
Are they getting better or worse or more chaotic, more mischievous or what?
Yeah.
Sometimes I thought it went a little bit crazy tonight, but maybe that's part of the showmanship. I don't know.
I thought that it's too much of a slugfest, and I get very concerned about the people that are watching at home.
How about Trump? What do you think he thinks watching it? Do you think he's winning?
Well, that's the problem. The more they fight, the more it's an advantage to him. And I don't mind us having policy arguments, which I made today. And I think we are at this moment where people have to choose between Bernie and another candidate. I thought that was an argument worth making. But
I agree with you in terms of watching the debate as an observer, and I do take an interest in it. Why did people like your colleague Elizabeth Warren go after Mike Goldberg?
You know, she has every right to go after the mayor. He's still on the debate
stage. But he's not the leader. The leader is Bernie. He's the one to beat. Everybody knows that.
I just look at it practically. I want to win. So if you want to win, you go after an ideology that you don't agree with. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't legitimate questions about Michael Bloomberg. But the issue is, are people debating to have a soundbite on TV the next morning so you get more money into your account? Or are people debating to bring the American people with them that are watching it now on TV, since this has become more and more people watching? So I opted for the second. I think you've got to make the case. And that was obviously my coronavirus answer. I think we're dealing with a very serious public health matter, and we better start acting like a president instead of wanting to be president.
It seems to be the #1 Republican talking point starting pretty soon after Milwaukee. Whoever, if it's Bernie's the nominee, will be, we're getting rid of your private health care. And people are always more concerned about what they have rather than what they might get. And it seems to be by saying you cannot have private health insurance once this is over. Once I get in there, you don't have an option. What do you think about it? Is that an issue?
That's why I just keep imagining Donald Trump prosecuting his case against Elizabeth or against Bernie. And the #1 focus is going to be, because they both put their names on that bill, it's his bill, but her name's on it, is that in 4 years, 149 million Americans will be kicked off their current health insurance. That's what it said. She'd delay it by a year or two, but that's exactly what it says. I think the better thing is a public option. It would bring people making about $100,000, just that one example, brings their premiums down by 50%.
What happens if this big Medicare for All thing goes bankrupt? Then you can't raise all these sources of money. These trillions of dollars. What happens if they don't come?
That is,
it's the only system we have.
I think that they do a disservice to the voters out there when they aren't straight about how much this costs and why it's a problem, what it's going to do to rural hospitals. I am valiantly making that case. And Super Tuesday, as well as South Carolina, but Super Tuesday is going to be a whole other thing. They're not caucuses, except America's.
When will one of you moderates decide that you have to get out and let one person go? When will that happen?
This is, right now we got 2 billionaires there flanking the stage that don't have one delegate. I actually have the 3rd biggest vote total so far on that stage. The voters are going to decide that, so you let the voters decide, and 1/3 of America is going to vote on Super Tuesday.
It's just that the moderates seem to maybe have most of the votes, but they're dividing them up 4 or 5 ways. Isn't that a problem?
It's a primary.
Thank you.
Super Tuesday.
We all know the same situation, but we have different roles to play. Thank you very much, Senator. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you both. And as we like to remind everybody, it's just the second primary of the season that we've yet to have on Saturday. Robert Gibbs, I have two questions for you.
Yes, sir.
Endeavor your very best to answer them honestly.
Yes, sir.
Number one, did everyone on that stage tonight deserve, to Chris's last question, to be on that stage tonight at this stage of the race? And number two, how worried are you about the Democrats' chances against this president?
Well, on the first question, look, I still do think it's early. The one thing that happens in these races is it's going to become late quickly.
Yeah.
Right? You know, by the time we have the next debate, we'll have had almost 30 different states and territories that have weighed in on this, and that's just in 19 days. So, look, I think the challenge that many of the candidates have on that stage is they don't actually have a real path to that nomination, right? And I think this is going to become apparent. We're in the second state where you've got votes that don't look like Iowa and New Hampshire, meaning 90% plus white. And so are you going to be able to put together Hispanic voters, African-American voters, Asian-American voters, plus white voters in order to move your candidacy forward? And I think it'll be obvious, if it's not after South Carolina, it certainly will be after Super Tuesday, that it just can't happen. In terms of how worried are you, look, I'm a lot less worried than Senator Klobuchar is that we're in the process of trying to pick a candidate and there's arguments that break out. That is the entire process. And whoever emerges is going to be stronger for having gone through this, because whatever prosecution they're getting tonight, it is going to be a lot stronger. It is going to be backed up by $750 million to $1 billion. So if you can't get this argument right in front of a raucous crowd in Charleston, then it's going to be a long fall for you. So I think the fighting back and forth is okay. I think that will help settle out and emerge who does have a path, not just to winning the nomination, but ultimately winning the White House.
Thank you for endeavoring.
Yes, sir.
Another break in our coverage. When we come back,
There's a majority of the American people who I think right now just want to be able to turn on the TV, see their president, and actually feel their blood pressure go down a little bit instead of up through the roof.
that's our next guest, standing by live, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, with Chris. Chris?
Thank you very much, Brian. Mayor, you did say that, and then I thought you might have defend yourself at the end by saying I'm not boring or something. I mean, you really think you can cool these things, our government down, our politics down?
What we know is the chaos that we're living through right now cannot continue. The American people are so exhausted, and what we're seeing is how toxic and how divided and how cruel our politics have become. Now, there's always going to be fighting in politics, but what we've got to do is come together and remember what we're fighting for. That fighting is not the point. And what we saw tonight was, I think, two very different visions. Senator Sanders, which is about going all the way out here, and anybody who disagrees with you be damned. Mine is about making sure that we draw as many people as we can into a coalition that really will support big progressive change and can do it without us further dividing the country.
Talk about division. People who have health care now, a plan they're happy with, maybe a good corporate job, they want to keep it. People like what they have, a bird in the hand, the whole thing. Is it consistent with a free society to tell people you take the government plan or you don't get health insurance? There is no option. There is no free option. There's no private sector option like there is in other countries like the UK or in Canada, where you can have additional health care options.
Right. Part of what I was pointing out tonight is that even in countries that have public single payer,
like Denmark,
even in countries that have straight up socialized medicine, there's still at least the option of a private plan.
Is it consistent with a free society to deny people the option of how to provide for their health care?
I don't think it's consistent with a free society to say that this industry may not exist at all. Now, what I do believe is that industry is letting people down, which is why I want to create a public alternative. And if, as progressives, if we're right that it's going to be better than any of the private options, then everybody will choose it, and it'll be the only one left standing. But I'm not willing to dictate that from Washington. I want Americans to choose for themselves.
Speaking of bad countries, bad leaders, Putin. apparently has decided, I love to pronounce that name that way, Putin has decided it's in his weird-ass interest to promote the chances of Bernie Sanders winning this nomination fight. What do you think he's up to? What scurrilous effort is he up to here?
So, you know, trying to understand the mind of Vladimir Putin is not my specialty. But what I do know is it's very clear that the Russian Federation wants chaos. Yeah, of course. It's in their interest for there to be chaos. They've delivered a certain kind of chaos by helping President Trump get elected, and they're going to continue to do whatever they can to divide the American people. It's why we need to make sure that we not only elect a president, but put forward a candidate who thinks about unifying the American people. That's why we've been able to perform the best of any candidate besides Bernie Sanders on votes, on delegates, because we were offering a message that calls people in instead of calling people names.
You went further on the stage tonight. You said Putin basically wants Bernie versus Trump.
Well, look, again, I don't think that Putin has a political party. I think he wants there to be chaos. And I also think that there's a level of chaos and toxicity and division that will continue. I mean, just picture it. Picture spending the rest of this year in a Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump election. I mean, what's going to be left after that?
I know. You said something that was pretty rough, and I thought it was very much in tune with the mood of the week, given what happened on 60 Minutes this Sunday and the discussion of Bernie Sanders' comments over the years about Castro. And you said nobody's getting elected in this country talking about the bright side of the Castro regime.
Yeah, and I'm really worried not just about winning the White House, but right here in Charleston. This seat went Democratic. It was an improbable victory for an excellent Democratic candidate. And I could see him out in the audience, Joe Cunningham, just one example of people who are flipping seats. We have a responsibility as candidates to make their lives a little easier, not a little harder. And when you talk to those frontline Democrats, and I try whenever I can to reach out to those who are...
You're talking about people like the Collier counties of Philadelphia, places where they have better off communities that flipped against Trump.
Yeah, I mean, we're different, districts have different stories, but what's consistent is that not one of the 40 Democrats who have flipped those seats in the last election are supporting Senator Sanders or supporting his platform. They're running away from it because they know how much trouble it will create for them trying to keep the House in Democratic hands. I think we should listen to them. Whenever I call them, I always ask, are there things you see us doing that could make your job easier or make your job harder? Let's listen to them because they know more than anybody about how to win in the Trump era.
Who will be the last person standing against Bernie between now and Milwaukee? You or the former vice president? You or Biden? Who's going to get that moderate lane option to fight on against Bernie Sanders?
Here's why it ought to be me, in my obviously biased view, which is that I am the candidate who has gotten the most delegates beside Bernie Sanders. I'm the one who's gotten the most votes besides Bernie Sanders. So if you're looking for somebody besides Bernie Sanders, I think my campaign is for you. And of course, I got to say that if you believe that, I need folks to go to PeteForAmerica.com and throw in a few bucks to help us get it done. But that's how we're going to win. By the way, I'm the only one who's beaten Bernie Sanders at anything in 2020. We have got to coalesce and get the job done, or we could wake up the day after Super Tuesday past the point of no return.
Do you think Bernie had a bad night tonight?
I think it was tough because he was actually held to account for
people booed him
the way he's talked and for these visions. Look, again, there's nothing extreme about wanting higher wages, wanting health care for everybody, wanting corporations to be held accountable, which is why I'm for those things. What's extreme is to take it all the way out to the edge and they then say anybody who disagrees with you doesn't even belong in the fight with us.
Great debating tonight. There's a lot of packed housing tonight, I noticed. You noticed the cheering sections were particularly loud?
Yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm out there.
Well, I think there's a lot of packing of the house, but thank you. Anyways, back to you, Brian. Pete Buttigieg taking on Bernie. It looks like these two guys are ready to go at each other.
Thank you, Mayor Pete. Thank you, Chris Matthews. Steve Kornacki, as promised, is at his station at the big board with a look at the numbers. If we freeze the situation right now today, where we are. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Brian. Yeah, so this was the story coming into this debate. This was our NBC News Marist poll here in South Carolina. This was the big question. Was the debate going to change this? Biden, who has led from the beginning here in South Carolina, a 4-point advantage over Sanders in our poll. That is much tighter than we've seen for months. Biden's been ahead in this state by 20, 25, 30 points, down to 4 coming into this debate. Obviously, Steyer, a wild card in the state with all the money he's spending. You just had Buttigieg there. You see in single digits, Pete Buttigieg, despite the early success he had in Iowa and New Hampshire. Big reason for that. When you look here in South Carolina, of course, we are talking about among white voters, you see Buttigieg very much in contention there, basically tied with Biden, Sanders out in front. But, of course, South Carolina is the first test of a large African-American electorate. 60% of the Democratic electorate on Saturday will be black. Biden in our poll with a 15-point advantage here here over Sanders. Steyer right behind him. You see Buttigieg, this has been the story for him all along, back at 4% here. So that's why he's still stuck in single digits. The other big divide we see here in South Carolina, it is age, under 45 years old. Look at that, by a 3-to-1 margin. Bernie Sanders leading Joe Biden, crushing Joe Biden. You flip it around, though, 45 plus, completely different story. There's Biden way in front, Steyer in second, Sanders all the way back at 13%, a distant third. So black voters, older voters, that's who Joe Biden is counting on to get what he said tonight must win for him.
All right, Steve Kornacki, thanks. Vicki, you have actual living, breathing college students whose intellect you are partially responsible for. What do you tell them about the fact that 7 people on the stage tonight, 2 of them are bona fide bust-out billionaires?
There's a lot of concern among students with this issue of inequality. And who better to represent inequality in this country than billionaires? If you remember the last debate, there was a question of, should you exist? So I think that's the existential question for a lot of these students who know that they're going to have debt coming out. Maybe they don't necessarily want the full-blown doing away with the debt, as Bernie Sanders says, but they just want to have a fair shake. They want to be able to do as well as their parents are doing, live that American dream, and they're seeing that it's not happening. So you see the appeal for Sanders in this case, but you also see the appeal for Warren as well as Pete Buttigieg. I think generationally, it's hard to connect with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is beloved among those 45 plus that we saw earlier. He's beloved among certain demographics, but young folks just can't connect with him. So that's the problem. Inequality is a big issue, so that takes Bloomberg out of the race. That takes Steyer out of the race for the most part. Who's left in the middle? And I think this is the bigger issue when we're talking about the Democratic primary, which is how do we consolidate that middle? Bernie Sanders has a strong cohort, but who is going to emerge out of that to fight for that inequality?
Elizabeth Warren tonight, in the eyes of a lot of people watching, took a big swing and a lot of people thought was a miss on a big topic of interest to Michael Bloomberg. She is going to be among our guests when we come back at the top of the hour with Chris Matthews. Our live coverage continues with that after this.